Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to this discussion by one of the scholars whom I admire the most and have learned the most about in recent times, Daniel Deudney. He's an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University. He's got his BA from Yale, a master's in science, technology, and public policy from GWU, and his PhD from Princeton. He tells me he spent 7 years in Washington, 3.5 on the Hill, working with energy and the environment, and 3.5 with the World Watch Institute, which is right down the road from us. His current project is rethinking the nuclear revolution in light of 9/11. Now, if that were his complete resume, then he'd be one of the ablest political scientists around. But it's particularly this book, Bounding Power, Republican Security Theory from the Polis to the Global Village, that inspired me to ask Dr. Deudney to give his talk here today. There's been a lot of discussion in recent years of realism versus idealism, of Bismarckian realpolitik versus Wilsonian democracy promotion. And this tends to sort of degenerate into a battle of stereotypes and caricatures on either side. And to make it even more frustrating, there's a distinction in both the way we study the subjects and also in the way we talk about them between political theory over here, political science, international relations, IR theory, and even international law, which is often its own little compartmented universe. These things used to be discussed in the same breath by the same people. If you think about the founders and the Federalist Papers, if you think about the great philosophers and publicists of the 19th century, and one of the things that Dr. Deudney is, in my estimation, is the peer of many of these thinkers. What he's done is, instead of simply tunneling along, through a little narrow furrow within our existing academic divisions, is to rethink basic principles of social order without necessarily observing conventional distinctions between internal and external foreign policy and domestic policy. Now, that means his work can be a challenge to follow, and because he is, really breaking outside of the conventional boxes of thinking about these things. But I think that if you make the investment to read him and also to listen to him, you'll be greatly rewarded, and so you'll be able to think about both of politics, of the politics of human beings, in a way that transcends the categories in which we usually think about it. So with that, I'd like you to welcome Dr. Daniel Deudney.
Thank you, Michael. Well, normally when I give a talk like this, I have lots of blackboards, and I put various things on the blackboard. So instead of that, I've distributed these sheets that have the figures on them, and we'll be using that as our basic template here. I should emphasize the point that Michael pointed to, which is that this is not really a policy talk. If you're interested in what we should do about Iraq next, you should probably leave right now. Rather, this is attempting to get a more fundamental level of understanding about where we are. And I think that the fundamental fact that we are all acutely conscious of at this point is that the American Liberal Internationalist Project, which has defined the progressive agenda with regard to American foreign policy over the last century and intensively over the last half century, is now in crisis. The international institutions, many of the most important ones, are in decay. The support for the liberal internationalist agenda domestically is in disarray. And we also are facing a whole new range of threats that are in a sense historically unprecedented, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and the consequences for the survival of the Constitution domestically, given weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and given the kinds of measures that we are likely to be drawn to do to combat this threat. And so what I want to do is step back and try and provide us with an old but an updated framework for understanding where we are, where we've been, and where we're going. And I'm going to do this in hopefully a little over half an hour. Yes, laughter is appropriate at that stage. A starting point would be about metaphors. We're globalists here, I would assume, most of us, and we have this overwhelming realization that global interdependence and the fact that we are now in a closed, highly interdependent world is overwhelmingly true to most of the audience here today, although, of course, not to most people in the world. But we have various images of the Earth and of the global, and it's, I think, useful to start by subverting some of the more common ones that we have. One of them is, perhaps the most common, is global village, Marshall McLuhan's notion. And that was very valuable in capturing the telecommunications, abolition of distance, the fact that we were all within connectivity in real time, and this was historically unprecedented. But the image of global village is, in an important way, very misleading, because villages are largely static places, not much goes on in them, and the village image fails to capture the fact that things have been in rapid motion and are likely to continue in accelerating motion. And so I want to step back and suggest another metaphor drawn from political science, an old tradition. People talk about the ship of state, and we've got sort of the captain and navigating where we're going to go. And this is an image of statecraft that the realists like because it suggests that things are orderly and the crew is going to take orders and the captain is going to decide where to go and so forth. That image is also very misleading for our global condition because it's much too organized. It suggests much too much political structure. It's much too elevated. The reality, I suggest, is a low reality, and that is that we should think about our condition, this is my sort of proposal for a metaphor, as a global debris mat. It's a debris mat. And I want to introduce the dynamic element with the notion that this debris mat is on a river, and that over time, over the last 500 years, the human condition has changed. And in the past, there were multiple slow-moving tributaries, separate peoples on their separate little rafts and clusters of debris. Over the last 5 centuries, all of these rafts and debris clusters have come together in one central river. And this river has been going faster, and all of these different pieces have collided with one another. And for most people, for most peoples, the last 500 years has been catastrophic. In the United States, we live in an historical bubble in this regard. Right? Everything has been getting better, and peace and security and prosperity and liberty and so forth. That's not been the overwhelming historical experience over these last 5 centuries. Genocide, enslavement, massive epidemics, world wars. So what I suggest we do is think about a global debris mat, all these peoples coming together and kind of ramming into one another. And at the center of this global debris mat sits a raft. It's a low thing. It's lashed together logs. And that's the United States of America. And this is by far the most seaworthy part of this conglomeration. But the navigational capability of this raft, of this lashed together set of logs, we're above the water largely. But we are impinged. We have around us all these other pieces of stuff of much less organized polities, and many of the people there are underwater or bobbing up and down at the edge of the water. They are highly insecure and they're highly disorganized. This is a river of no return, and the trajectory of the river that we see is quite clear, which is that we look and the pace of the river flow is accelerating. Right? Things are happening more rapidly, and we look into the future, and it's foggy, of course. We can't see the future, but there's good reason to believe there's roars in the distance. We're going to be coming upon rapids. We're going to be coming upon major systemic crises. And so we need to basically be thinking about actually achieving a raft craft on the global scale. We're not talking about building a ship that we can navigate, in this sort of complex and sophisticated ways, but we've got to reconfigure this debris mat into something that at least we have primitive steerage capacity. And that is the project of extending and also of securing the United States of this raft, because we're stuck with all these other people. We can't move on our own. We're all enmeshed with them. So I suggest that is an image that captures the dynamism and the very uneven situation of the world, the historical trajectory from the past, and where we need to be going. Now, let me shift into the actual argument of this book, which I'm going to be hitting the high points of here. This is a work of political theory, of international political theory, of world political theory. And I begin, as many of you who've studied these subjects, I assume are also with me, is that the global as a phenomenon has not been handled well by international relations theory. And we have, over the last decade or so, globalization that people talk about. But globalization, understood as rising levels of interdependence, has been occurring over 5 centuries. It's the dominant narrative of the human condition over the last half millennium. Rising levels of interdependence with regard to military security, with regard to ecological, with regard to economic, with regard to cultural. All of this rising interdependence has been occurring. That's globalization. The second set of contemporary issues that international theory has been woefully inadequate in grasping is the role of liberty and the role of political freedom and the status of the United States in world politics. We not only take for granted our security and our prosperity, but we also take for granted our liberty. And in the overall annals of the human experience, political freedom has been historically rare. This end of history optimism and this notion that there's this preordained conclusion towards universal freedom is an outcome that one has to say is very alien to much of the Western tradition thinking about the conditions of political liberty. The tradition of political liberty, of republicanism, popular sovereignty, limited government, political liberty, has been until very recently very tragic in its orientation. The best thinkers in the West thought that political liberty was something that was not likely to ever be universalizable. It was something that was dependent on very particularistic circumstances. The republics were rare, they were precarious. Over the last 2 centuries, that has changed. And the key reason why that has changed, I would argue, is the founding of the United States of America, which have altered the political prospects for free government on this planet. Now, of course, we have lots of liberals, and we have liberal IR, and liberal IR is, of course, mainly focused on commerce and the democratic peace. And there's a vast literature among my fellow academics of all these careful studies where they analyze democracies. Do they make war against one another? Dyads, as they're called, pairs of states. Are they peaceful? And it seems to be a fairly robust conclusion that democracies are peaceful. And this is liberal international relations theory. Commerce is good too. Commerce is going to increase interdependence. Right? That liberal narrative has left out this pessimistic earlier understanding of the political preconditions of free government that culminated in the founding of the United States. And so what I want to do is try and reconstruct actually existing international relations theory. And if you'll turn to the first of my little cartoons here, which is like on this one, the sort of Venn diagrams here, I'm going to focus on republicanism. And the contemporary universe of international theory is very diverse. But people, I think, would generally agree that realism is currently hegemonic particularly when the issue of security is involved. There are all sorts of other schools and issues and so on, but hegemonic intellectual power conceptually still is with the realists. And over the last couple of decades, liberal international theory has challenged realism in various ways. So we have these two big clusters, realism and liberalism, and they contain a great deal of insight. And my objective here today is not to convince you to throw out realism and liberalism, but rather to put them in a matrix of which they are part of a bigger argument. And that bigger argument is republicanism. Now, if you look at this figure, I've got the realism circle and the liberalism circle. Realism, the three key ideas in realism, this is again a simplification, the anarchy problematique, the balance of power, society of states. These are like the tall poles in the realist theoretical tent. Similarly, liberalism, democratic peace, commercial peace, and various ideas of weak international unions. These are the six polar ideas in realism and liberalism. And the starting point for this project, how it in part evolved, is that I began to realize, and people know this but they don't draw out its implications, is that the terms realism and liberalism were invented in the 19th century. And so when the realists run around and say Thucydides, realist, or Machiavelli, or Hobbes, or Rousseau, realist, they're taking a label. This is a project of the middle years of the 20th century. They're taking this label and sticking it on these guys. Similarly, liberalism is an early 19th century coinage. People didn't talk the language of either realism or liberalism. And these ideas that I mention here, these six polar ideas, all six of these polar ideas in both realism and liberalism long predate the establishment of realism and liberalism. Right? And the realist construction, it's from Thucydides, it's from Hobbes. Right? Realism is tremendously powerful precisely because it claims to have this tradition. Right? It's got this sort of default intellectual status, right? Because they can always say, well, things might be a little different now. We don't really know for sure, but our view of the world has been vindicated by time. Our view of the world, our realist view of the world, has this authoritative status because of these key historical figures. As a synthesis, as a précis of the best political thought of the West about security and political order, realism is extremely powerful in the contemporary construction. Now, the reality is, as I just said, is a fiction coined in the 20th century. All six of these ideas, these six polar ideas, were originally conceptualized in the language of republicanism. Now, my objective is not simply to assemble these six ideas, but rather to assemble them with ideas that fell by the wayside in this breakup, in effect, of republicanism into realism and liberalism. So think of contemporary realism and liberalism as big fragments, big chunks of what had been Republican security theory. And so the contemporary international theorist is sort of like Moliere's bourgeois gentleman, surprised to find that he's long been speaking republicanism and not knowing it. These core ideas are from republicanism. We want to put them together again. Now, what happens when we put them together? Turn to the next figure. I'm not simply attempting to make a complex argument. Really, I'm attempting to make a simple argument. And that is that when we assemble these pieces from realism and liberalism and the forgotten pieces, we actually see a whole, a very simple whole, that all of these other arguments are subsets of. And this simple, newly seen, very old whole is on page 2 here of the handout, and it's basically two problematiques. Western thought about the problem of security from violence and political order is essentially summarized in these two problematiques. This is Republican security theory from which all these fragments come. The first problematique is about anarchy and interdependence. I'm going to unpack that. And the second is hierarchy and restraint. Now, there is a bumper sticker version of this. It's very simple, really, which is that security from violence requires the simultaneous avoidance of the extremes of anarchy and hierarchy. Simultaneously avoid the extremes of hierarchy and anarchy over successively larger spatial scales because of changes in technology. You want to be secure? Avoid hierarchy and anarchy in their extremes and do so over larger spatial scales as technology changes. That's the Western tradition. Right? That's the bumper sticker version. Everything else is a subset. Let's unpack these two problematiques. Now, I'm going to go into this argument about anarchy and interdependence because it's the single most important argument in Western thought. And it's also the argument that reverses the presumption about world government today. All right, this is something that I'm going to reverse this widespread view that world government's utopian in some fundamental way. Reverse the presumption of utopianness that all of us who advocate the liberal internationalist project and its robust policy agendas are always laboring under. Anarchy, interdependence, problematique. If you'll turn to the next page, we have a very simple cartoon here about the ideas of the anarchy problematique. And this is, everyone who studies international politics, this is like sort of ground knowledge, okay? This is a sort of simple worldview. And the categories actually come from Hobbes, the state of nature and the state of war and then government. Now, we have a line of argument that goes all the way back to the beginning, which says there is this anarchy, this pre-state anarchy. And Hobbes characterized it as, in this situation, life is nasty, brutish, and most importantly, potentially short. It is acutely insecure. And so the overwhelming argument that we see repeated in all sorts of different conceptual vocabularies is, get out of this pre-state anarchy. Establish authoritative government, otherwise unspecified. Authoritative government. Now, then we have international relations properly understood or conventionally understood, which is we have an interstate anarchy. These governments that have been formed by groups to get out of this pre-state anarchy are the members of an international system. Right? And they are engaged in various interactions with one another. But here, we don't typically see the argument that, oh, they need to get out of this anarchy. Because this anarchy, this state of war anarchy, is conventionally understood as, yes, it can be nasty and brutish, but life for these units is rarely short. They're safe to a first approximation. Now, they get banged around and, at the margins, dented and so forth. But there's no argument that we see that says, get out of this anarchy. And indeed, we look at the contemporary discourse over the last half century, realism and its arguments about the nuclear revolution very much track this. We don't have to get out of anarchy. We can stay in anarchy. Now, I ask you the question, what is the difference between these two anarchies? They're both anarchies in the sense that there's no government. And the simple answer to that question is, if you turn the next page, violence interdependence. Violence interdependence is the master variable in Western thought about the material context, about geography and technology as shaping variables, violence interdependence. Now, what is violence interdependence? A simple image. Let's imagine that this room is the whole world. And we're focused solely on security now. And first stage, everyone in the room has pencils and pens. Now, some people might have more pencils or pens than other people, and that's going to be a distributional variation. But then we imagine a technological change, and instead of pencils and pens, now people have knives. The shift from pencils and pens to knives is a shift in the level of violence interdependence present in the space. Imagine technological change continuing. We have guns now. People have handguns. Some might have more than others. That's a balance or distribution issue. but the intrinsic capacity of these different technologies creates a level of violence interdependence within this particular space. Imagine we go further and we have now machine guns. That's a shift in violence interdependence. The level of violence interdependence present in this space has been going up. Now, with this very crude distinction in mind, I break violence interdependence into these 4 stages, or 4 different degrees. Absent, when it's not present at all. Weak or strong, we'll treat those as 1 for this treatment today. And then intense. Now, once we've made this schematization of this simple variable, the main argument about of Western thought, the first argument, the anarchy interdependence problematique, is very simple. It's in situations of intense violence interdependence, anarchy is incompatible with security. Anarchy is incompatible with security in situations of intense violence interdependence. On the other hand, in situations of weak or strong violence interdependence, anarchy is potentially compatible with security. You don't have to get out of anarchy if the violence interdependence is weak or strong. Now, that's the first key notion. That's what sits at the root of Western thought. And realism, contemporary realism with its anarchy problematique, you never hear the expression interdependence anarchy problematique. Interdependence is something that the realists say, oh, it's exaggerated in its effects, it's economic. This is a liberal argument. The liberals, on the other hand, are always talking about interdependence rising, but they too are focused on economic, increasingly ecological, and never talking about violence interdependence. So violence interdependence sort of fell between the cracks when this split of realism and liberalism occurred. Now, we can now turn to the overall argument. If you'll turn to what I think is labeled here, page 5. Yes. This is complicated. Everything in the argument rises up to this and out from this. Everything in the argument can be mapped onto this figure. Now, what do we do in this figure? On the horizontal axis, we have history crudely divided into 4 periods on the basis of the dominant technologies of violence and transportation and communication, leading up to this 4th period of the nuclear era. On the vertical axis, we have a measure of overall size, an order of magnitude each step up on that grid: city-state, nation-state, continental, the entire Earth. Now, within these 2 axes, what I've done in the center here is I have mapped the historical degree, in very rough terms, of violence interdependence. And that's what these diagonal hatched lines indicate. These diagonal hatched lines delineate violence interdependence, the degree of violence interdependence which is present over time. Now, you see that the whole bottom of this figure, the bulk of it, is intense violence interdependence. Strong is this middle band, and weak is this top one. Okay? Now, given this, we can see the evolution over time of the main argument of the first problematique, the anarchy interdependence problematique, about violence interdependence and its relationship to political order. We're going to walk up the A1, A2, A3, A4. A1 is the Greeks, the problem of the city-state internally. Thucydides' image of the Caesarean Civil War has had this classical, canonical status of the state of nature, the vision of it. Then we come to the early modern period, and we get the same argument made over again by Baudin and, most importantly, Hobbes. But now the argument is being made on an order of magnitude larger spatial scale. And the state of nature anarchy that's pointed to as to be avoided at all cost is Germany during the 30 Years' War. This war of all against all, this catastrophic anarchy of the state of nature. Then we cross into the 3rd vertical column, the Industrial Revolution. People forget this, but starting in the late 19th and then in the early 20th century, Europeans of all different political orientations were drawing the conclusion that the Industrial Revolution had changed the implication of war for Europe. that war was going to be, in the industrial era, total war. That the conclusion, therefore, is they were in a state of nature anarchy, now on a continental scale. And they had to get out of this anarchy. If they didn't get out of this anarchy, they were going to have total wars. They had to have government on a European-wide scale. And yes, then there was the secondary debate about, is it going to be imperial, a la Hitler, or is it going to be a confederal model like the European Union? But that you had to get out of anarchy, an anarchy that for centuries had been tolerable for security is now intolerable. Is intolerable. They agreed on that. All right. Then we cross over into the fourth period, our period, the nuclear revolution, just half a century old, an unfolding change in the level of violence, interdependence on now a global scale is intense, would be the argument. Now, this is an argument that, in one sense, we all kind of recognize, but that we forget that the first arguments that were made about the nuclear revolution in the late 1940s, the dominant position between roughly 45 and 55 was nuclear one-worldism. The argument being that continental-size units, like the United States and the Soviet Union, have been rendered obsolete for the provision of security by the development of nuclear weapons. This was a view that was voiced by world federalists, but also by people like Hans Morgenthau, the dean of American realists during this period. He is writing as late as the mid-60s that the nation-state, the United States and Soviet Union, they're obsolete. We've got to have world government. Right? This is a world government argument. We've got to get out of anarchy. It's now intense on a global scale. We've got to have world government. They debate and disagree about how to get to it, about what kind it is. Morgenthau actually sees us in a tragic impasse. We lack the political preconditions, but we have to have it, and therefore we need to make all our efforts move towards it. It's going to be difficult, multi-decades, but that we had to have it to be secure was the first argument about the nuclear revolution. Now, of course, that argument fell by the wayside. Right? Deterrence came along. Deterrence, right, is actually a very, very revolutionary notion for how a political system would be ordered over a longer period of time. Because the argument of this earlier group of Morgenthau and company, they weren't saying there was something fundamentally new about this. They were saying that it was the same old pattern that we've seen over and over again, now on this larger planet-wide scale. Deterrence, on the other hand, is revolutionary conceptually and flawed in key ways from that. And they're basically, it's very appealing, deterrence, because it says all we have to do is structure our forces in these particular ways. It becomes a policy question. Structure our forces in a particular way, and the probability of great power war falls to near zero. And we don't have to go through this strenuous effort of creating world governance to regulate this capability. It's like this best of all possible worlds. We have peace and we have plurality without getting out of anarchy. Now, I take that 9/11 is an important reopening of this nuclear debate, of the deterrence paradigm. Hasn't been destroyed, but it's been damaged. We are now in a situation where we face the threat of weapons of mass destruction capability leaking into the hands of actors that can't be deterred. And that takes us back to the radical questions that were raised in the early nuclear era. Now, what I've essentially done is said the Western tradition of thought, the canon, properly understood, is an argument for a type of world government. Right? And we reverse the presumption of the novelty here. From this standpoint of this argument, from the standpoint of the tradition properly read, what would be novel is if we stayed in an anarchy and had intense violence interdependence and didn't have disaster. That would be new. That would be historically unprecedented. World government isn't unprecedented in this most important way. Now, the second point, and this is our segue into the second problematique and the issues of liberty and understanding the United States. If you look at this figure, A1 through 4, as we walked up this diagonal, we see an important way in which world government would be unprecedented and an important fact about all other governments to date. And that is that they, all these previous governments, perhaps with the exception of Easter Island, have had to have a foreign policy. Right? That is to say, if you look at this figure, we got A1, okay? Look up the vertical column. It is a unit in B1 in the Greek city-state system. A2, say England or France. It is a unit in B2, the European state system. A3, a continental size space. It is a unit within the global state system. States have, throughout history, have not only had to overcome this internal anarchy, this pre-state anarchy, but then they've had to navigate in this larger anarchy marked by strong or weak violence interdependence. And that's, of course, realist foreign policy arguments come into play here. Look as we go up to A4. This is an unprecedented situation. A world government wouldn't be unprecedented in the most important sense, but its character potentially could be, because a world government, barring colonization of space and aliens, doesn't have to have a foreign policy. It doesn't have to have measures to deal with other policies outside itself. Right? Now, that's profoundly important in terms of thinking about the character of a world government. And this brings us into the Republican limited sense of limited government argument. The second problematique tells us that hierarchy and restraint is the other side of it. Remember I said it's the extremes of anarchy and of hierarchy are simultaneously to be avoided. Now, when we look historically, the simultaneous avoidance of hierarchy as well as anarchy has not been that common. The Western tradition, the tradition that culminates in its early modern phase in the founding of the United States, is essentially attempting to not only get out of first anarchy, but also to avoid hierarchy. And so we can look at A1, 2, 3. Those are the steps up, the key innovations, the Greek city-state. Then we come to the early modern period, scaling up to the size of a nation-state through mechanisms of limited government constitution and representation. And then the next step, the crucial next step, the founding of the United States, in order for the scale, for the size of a Republican unit to get an order of magnitude larger, roughly. Now, I'm going to unpack this narrative, say a few things about it, because unless we understand this narrative, unless we understand why the founding of the United States was this crucial threshold event, we have thrown away key pieces of what we need to know to grapple with the next stages of security globalization. Now, I can unpack this as considerable length. How long have I gone? 10 or 15 minutes more? Okay. Let's say a few words about the United States and why it's so important and why it was such a turning point. I began at the beginning by pointing out that the historical view was that republics were rare and precarious. The reasoning is very simple. It's that to be a republic, to have self-government, and in crude early forms, you had to be small because people had to get together. It was a municipal level, city-state type of republic. And the problem, of course, is that they were going to be, because they were small, they were going to be gobbled up by other states. Right? This was the pattern. This was universally recognized as this intrinsic peril of republican government. And they depended on little geographic circumstances, out on a point or an island, and they depended on a system being fragmented without a giant power. But all of them eventually succumbed in the ancient world, as well as in Renaissance Italy, to domination by larger units. Larger units were understood to be intrinsically non-republican, to be intrinsically hierarchical in character. Then we have the scale-up that occurs in the early modern Europe. And this is why England is so important. This is why the establishment of constitutional government, government dominated by the commons, by the bulk of the people, or at least the wider strata of people vis-a-vis historical times. That takes us then to the founding of the United States. The American founders were the heirs of all of this. Go back and read the first 14 or so Federalist Papers. It's all of the key insights of realism about security with this argument about a hierarchy. And the argument that they make is that this is a new order of the ages. This is something that stands outside the traditional typologies of republics as were understood by political theory and experienced in history. And the reason why it was so potentially revolutionary in its implications for political liberty is because it was going to combine Republican government internally with size that previously had only been associated with an empire, and hence tremendously improved security. That the prospects for political liberty were radically altered by this. This outside extinction conquest problem had been significantly addressed, or that was their argument. Now, another, I think, interesting sort of our heritage that we forget, early modern Republican thought is overwhelmingly focused on the Roman Republic. This is, these guys this is this overwhelming reality for them. And they are measuring the modern condition as different from what? The Roman Republican experience. And the essential narrative that everyone agreed about was that Rome was the exception that proved the rule in ancient times. It was initially a little city-state, actually highly democratic in some regards. It was militarily precocious. It was highly successful. It was able to secure itself through this endless series of wars to the point where it swallowed the entire state system of the Mediterranean basin. And as an inherent result of that success, through expansion and size, the Republican Constitution internally was overturned. It was fatally imbalanced by the expansion. And this is, of course, a narrative that we're all familiar with, the figures Caesar and Antony and Pompey and all of this, culminating in Octavian becomes, in effect, monarch. The Roman Republic is extinguished. That was the historical narrative that they were looking against. And what was the instrumentality, the crucial instrumentality that led to the fateful destruction of the Republic? Is they can't control the standing army. The army gets too big. Right? And the army, who takes over? Well, the generals. The civil wars are battles between different military factions. The American founders are obsessively concerned, therefore, not simply with getting big enough, but also of structurally guaranteeing against the various types of deformations, the loss of the control over the military arm. They are completely paranoid about a standing army, and they look to our insularity as this incredibly fortunate circumstance. Because we are distant from Europe, in terms of my language, we're in a weak violence interdependence relationship with them, and because we have consolidated, we can maintain a small central security government, a small standing army. They also wanted to have elections and put the war power largely in the hands of the Congress, militias of the states, the people numerous and armed as an ultimate counterbalance. This republic, this American system that I call the Philadelphian system, was not a standard state. It's not a Weberian state, that political science definition of monopoly of legitimate violence in a particular territory. There's no monopoly of violence in this system. You've got all these different actors, partial, checked and balanced violence capacity. Republics are systems of arms control. Right? Because Republican arms control is at the core of the American Constitution. Now, what happens over time to this American Republic? What happens over time to this vision of the founders? Throughout the 19th century, it remains more or less intact. There's all these internal conflicts and so forth. We have continental expansion. We come to the latter years of the 19th century, and we begin to get an argument that's made about the Industrial Revolution. This is the same types of argument that we were seeing in Europe about European anarchy now being intolerable. Same group of people. basically making the claim that this moat, this weak violence interdependence on a global scale, is now giving way to strong violence interdependence on a global scale. And it is at this juncture, in the later 19th century, early 20th century, that the agenda of liberal internationalism gets coined. It gets formulated. At this point, it gets formulated. Now, today, of course, we have lots of liberal internationalist portfolios and agendas, very sophisticated, very important in terms of managing global interdependence. But I think that we have forgotten, because we have forgotten this narrative, we have forgotten the Republican security core of this liberal internationalism. What is that argument? It's very simple. We are all familiar, of course, with the phrase Woodrow Wilson. We must make the world safe for democracy. Now, what is he saying here? It's that the international system has now become sufficiently interdependent, that the United States is going to be interacting with all of these other states on a global scale now, and if we do not change both the units and the system, constitutional democracy in the United States will eventually be lost. This is the project. We have got to change the other units away from their hierarchical configurations towards the Republican, and we've got to abridge interstate anarchy with various forms of international law, organization, and regimes, to take us out of anarchy, but not to a hierarchy, to have a union of republics, right, on a global scale that takes us out. Now, this is an argument that is made during this period. The Industrial Revolution is the dominant variable. People say, oh, liberalism is idealism. Liberalism has nothing to do with security from violence. Dead wrong in both cases. Right. This argument is not idealist in character, it's materialist in character. It's basically saying, hey, the world, the Industrial Revolution, the character of things has changed. And that's the driving factor. It's not that we want to go around the world and make it better. It's that the world is now impinged upon us to such a degree that unless we change it, it's going to change us. Now, how is the mechanism of change? How is the United States going to get corrupted? This is a line of argument, pieces of which we're all familiar with as well, but forget. Dwight Eisenhower, at the end of his presidency, he's an old-time Republican, warning of the military-industrial complex. The United States, staying in an interstate anarchy on a global scale, is going to have to become increasingly state-like, is going to have to become increasingly a monopoly of violence, mobilized, centralized, and deployed against outside threats. We forget that the middle years of the 20th century were extremely dark ones for liberal democracy. Not only were most liberal democracies wiped out, but there was this great fear that even if we were able to physically survive because of our giant size, we would become a garrison state. We would have to mobilize and centralize power to make the architecture, the fundamental principles of the Constitution of 1787 dead. Right? Liberty was going to be lost if we stayed in this arrangement. So, liberal internationalism, at its core, at its security core, is profoundly regime conservative. It's basically attempting to preserve limited government constitutional democracy within this unit that's in this situation of global interdependence. And if we don't do so, if we don't change the world, we're going to lose the Constitution. That's the basic narrative of it. That's the basic narrative. Now, we look at the world today, and of course, we have all these fragments of liberalism, and, you know, in one sense, neoconservatism is part of a fragment of this liberal internationalism, right? And the genealogy of the particular individuals, but more importantly, the concepts. They want democracy promotion. They've got one leg of this Wilsonian two-part agenda. But oddly enough, they have gone into complete reversal, complete opposition with regard to the other part of the agenda for building international law, institutions, and so forth. Now, let me say a couple of things about the most of what I've just said is in these figures, and I'll sort of illustrate a few of them if you would. Turn to page 10. This is really the core, the Republican security core of the 20th century American liberal internationalist project. And on the horizontal axis, I've got the extent to which the system is populated by republics and unions. And then on the vertical axis, I've got the extent of domestic hierarchy within the United States. And these two diagonal lines that are in play here are possibility frontiers. That is to say that in any particular period, you're going to have to be somewhere on one of those lines. And so the essence of the earlier situation, that highly steeped diagonal, we could be in a system in which most of the rest of the units could be hierarchies, and it could still be an anarchic system, and we could still have limited government. The arguments of the liberal progressives from the turn of the century, John Dewey really being the person who articulates this, I think, in the most profound theoretical way, is essentially that possibility frontier is sweeping out. And that's to say that if we don't get out of anarchy, we're going to have hierarchy domestically. Now, we're all concerned about the nuclear era, and my initial impulse in writing this book was really to give a theoretical foundation, if you would, for arms control, global nuclear arms control in our time, and to put it back at the center of the liberal internationalist agenda with this security element. Let me try and unpack this a bit more. Page 15, and I kind of partially said this at the top of the page, this is about how the anarchy has been interacting with our domestic republic. And on these figures, I use this language of negarchy, which is just a term that I'm trying to get us to use to capture the ordering principle of republics. And one of the blindnesses of contemporary international theory that realist gives us is that all political orders are either anarchies or hierarchies, a spectrum, a dyad, and various mixtures in between them. And of course, what that realist view does is it completely writes out of the basic typologies of political order our political experience, our political tradition. Because they say, well, we've got islands of hierarchy and a sea of anarchy. That's their vision of political order. And it's dropped the Republican side of it. It's dropped the hierarchy as problem side of the issue. And to capture the structural logic of republics understood as arrangements of mutual restraint. I use this language of negarchy, which is through all these figures in the book. So on page 15 here, this is a little image of what I was just saying here, the middle part of the page, the global industrial period, the garrison state hypothesis. Then we flip into the nuclear era, okay? And the global industrial period was very short. Really, it was less than a century in its full manifestations. And so what is the implication of nuclear weapons for the unit level? This is something that's remarkably non-discussed in both the literature and the policy. And there are three consequences. First of all is that constitutional democracy was significantly saved by the development of nuclear weapons. Dwight Eisenhower, who was this old-time Republican, fearful of centralized government, he liked nuclear weapons because it meant he didn't have to have a giant mobilized industrial military force. Had we been forced to defend Western Europe during the first decade or so of the Cold War, we would have had to mobilize at kind of half to two-thirds of World War II levels. And that would have profoundly deformed the domestic constitution. Imagine the industrial era going on for decades like that. That was a horror for these people. So nuclear weapons obviate that pressure, partially saving it. Second, constitutional democracy has been hollowed significantly. We're all aware of this. The pressures of speed have essentially rendered the check on the ultimate war-making power moot. The president is commander-in-chief, is not only in charge of the armed forces, but can obliterate the planet. I mean, it is one guy, right? It's a monarchy, it's a despotism. This language is used, and Charles Osgood and Tucker use that kind of language. Third, and this hasn't been fully noted, is that we have created within the state a state within a state within a state, and that's the nuclear complex. And people say, oh, we haven't had much nuclear arms control. I beg to differ. We've had very, very successful and highly innovative arms control during the nuclear period. But it's been statist hierarchical arms control. Recall earlier I said republics are systems of arms control. Early United States, a system of mutual check and balance. A state as a hierarchy is also a system of arms control. The monopoly of violence centrally directed. That's their basic paradigm. The security of the nuclear materials, look, depending on the efficiency of your design, there's enough separated plutonium, reprocessed plutonium, to build somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 Hiroshima-type bombs. And of course, we are worried about this in part. But look at what's happened over the 50 years of the Cold War. The government, the Atomic Energy Act of 1947 and after, created a total hierarchically governed space. All information, all people, all material are totally regulated within this space. Right? Now, and it's really good that they've done that, right? Because we have how many government programs? Let's say there's only enough fissionable material for 100,000 nuclear weapons. Okay? We haven't had leakage, or at least we don't know about it. How many government programs do we know that are 99% effective? That's utopian, right? But the record here seems to be 100,000 possible candidates for leakage over decades, and we've had no leakage. That's pretty remarkable. Right? That's a major change. Now, you can perhaps see where I'm going to be going with this. Turn to the next figure here, what I should call the shifting KK ratio. As I said earlier, 9/11 is of importance to us, not because of knocking down skyscrapers with airplanes, but I think of it as like a bolt of lightning on a dark night that illuminates an ominous new landscape, and that's the possibility of non-state actors using this capability, non-deterrable to a first approximation. This is something that everyone's been talking about, of course, and again, my sort of vein is to step back and think about this in a broader sense. And this is actually something that is profoundly novel in the human historical experience. Governments have been, insofar as they are governments, have been regulating violence capability from the beginning. Right? They have never had to deal with this contour of violence possibility. And I try and capture this here with what I call the KK ratio, the ratio of killers to killed, which I say is roughly, and this is actually very much of a headache to fully quantify this, but this is my rough conceptual image, that diagonal band there, 1 to 1 to 1 to 10 roughly, and W&D terrorism is taking us into a whole new space. It's basically saying that government is going to have to be, for primary security goals to be met, is going to have to be regulating at a micro level with high degrees of assurance. That's something that's never had to be done before. And so we say, well, we don't have our policy right. It's not surprising we don't have our policy right. And this is something that it goes beyond simply getting the U.S. policy this year, this decade right. It's much more profound than that. It's saying about the character of political structure, character of political organization that are going to be viable if we have in fact passed over this threshold of leakage and diffusion, or this possibility is permanently with us. Now, to sort of round it up here, because I have probably run out of time just about, I essentially make the positive policy alternative here on this last page, the back page of the whole flip out. The argument that I make here, and this is just about nuclear weapons, there's a biological part, which is actually, of course, much more pessimistic, really, because the key thing about nuclear weapons is that they depend upon this highly distinctive material, fissionable material. Right? It really is very, very special stuff. You don't have it, you don't have nuclear weapons. Right? And in terms of total amounts of materials that are within human activity, it's a tiny quantity of stuff, right? And we can shrink it. And the argument that I make here, and you can see that this is essentially the liberal internationalist security argument specified and applied now down to this nuclear argument, is that international nuclear containment, if we can get it complete, the diagonal is a possibility frontier, the vertical axis is the extent of penetration, the extent to which the government is going to penetrate down to the micro level. Right? 9/11 to the fifth power is going to give us the Patriot Act to the fifth power. Right? We're talking about the construction of a fully penetrative apparatus. We've got the technologies for this now, surveillance technology and so forth. We can build a panopticon that goes down to the capillary level of human interaction. And the people will demand it for purposes of security if this happens. Right? This is the pathway to the ultimate destruction of political liberty, to the ultimate destruction of limited government constitutionalism. So, if we can have complete nuclear containment, according to this argument, then the extent of penetration necessary goes way down. What we're in a sense faced with, you recall that earlier little figure where I had the sectoral totalitarian activity. If the stuff leaks out that has to be regulated, so too will the penumbra of control capabilities that will have to penetrate to civil society. That is to say that the project of arms control, this is like Baruch Plan, great-grandson of Baruch Plan. We know technically what this looks like, okay? It's outside the realm of the thinkable, and we don't understand that this is the centerpiece of the liberal internationalist agenda, which is necessary not just for the physical security of the country, although we're not talking about Cold War levels of total annihilation. A couple million people, a couple cities destroyed is really the horizon of a threat that we're faced with. But we're also faced with the type of response that we're going to be making to get rid of that. And so the argument is that the very, very ambitious nuclear arms control agenda should sit at the center of the liberal internationalist project, and that this liberal internationalist project is not being done for purposes of humanitarian betterment or anything like that, but for the security and survival of political liberty. Now, as a practical matter, I have to tell you I'm not optimistic. I look ahead, the global debris mat, all these factors are wrapped, enmeshed in it. I see these rapids, I see these various shocks ahead of us, and I think that we're going to potentially be looking back at this period of the last couple of centuries as historically anomalous. And we're going to go back to what was the human pattern of political liberty being extremely rare or being essentially non-existent. This is a project that Americans had better get out of their bubble about, okay? This is the survival of the fundamental principle of our political order. And unless we rouse ourselves, however improbably this is, I feel compelled to make an exhortation at the end. If we don't do this, if we're not successful in doing this, we're going to lose the project of political liberty that this country was defined by. That's it.
Bravo, bravo.
If you'll identify yourselves, please, when you ask a question. We'll see whether you have to, or if you speak loud enough, you may not need to.
Okay, good. It's very awkward carrying this around. I don't normally do this. Yes?
Tex Harris, American Foreign Service Association. Where are other people looking at and thinking about this macro concept that you talk about? As you talk about it, and as we kind of go back and look at it, it is understandable and frightening. But it seems like it is missing at this level of macroism in the debates that are going on. It has no voice.
Well, that's true, and that's why I'm here giving you this talk. I should mention Michael Lynn's book. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And I do think I brought it. He's an important, powerful voice in this vein as well, The American Way of Strategy, focusing on the United States as essentially within this line of not anarchy and not hierarchy, that the project of keeping government from becoming too big was central to our strategy all along. Look, this is a multi-sided task to get this kind of information around. It's not really information per se. It's really a frame. Okay, it's a narrative. And the narrative that I have laid out here, I believe, you'd be the judges of this, is first of all simple in its fundamentals. It is not like new. It's not like I've been off in my garret for 30 years coming in with my whole scheme. It's essentially a reading. Okay, I'm not, in one sense, I'm not claiming to do anything new. I'm claiming to see the whole that we've been living in and working with the parts, claiming to see that whole in a new way, and hence the parts in a new way. And then there's this question of the bigger issue of globalization, this 5-century process, and the American position in it. Americans are like living on another planet. They don't understand the degree to which this country has been extremely fortunate and had this great political advance, and that was all a close-run thing and had all these contingent features to it. And this 1990s narrative associated with my colleague Frank Fukuyama of the end of history and this trajectory that liberal democracy had won out, that was compelling only if we forget the security problem. Okay, that was a socioeconomic production, distribution type of argument, recognition type of argument. It's very compelling to think that we'd be at the end of history as long as we forget the single most important point of history, which is, as it relates to politics, which is not economics, but violence. Right? And Americans are, live in this historical bubble with regard to that, and forget the extent to which our tradition was an innovation, and that we have been successful because of those innovations.
And the corollary is because the refusal of Americans to accept degrees of violence which are probably normal, or not normal, but at least seen in other parts of the world, means a greater willingness to trade off the liberty for what would be lower levels of violence in other societies.
Yeah, if I could add something to that. Daniel and I both came to excavate this kind of buried tradition independently. In fact, I, as I've told him, I wish I'd known about his work before I wrote my book, because I would have drawn much more extensively on his writing. Coming from the IR theory, the international relations theory of the 80s and 90s, in reading what Franklin Roosevelt said, or Woodrow Wilson or Dwight Eisenhower, it makes no sense in terms of those categories. When Wilson is saying make the world safe for democracy, saying that we will have to essentially become an authoritarian state, if Germany conquers Europe and we're surrounded by these hostile empires. That's not what Wilsonianism is considered today. Just sort of promoting instant free elections everywhere in the world. That's not what Woodrow Wilson was about. There's some even stranger examples of how odd this Anglo-American or American tradition sounds. If you go back into the 19th century, in the late 19th century, the great powers of Europe got together to suppress piracy and signed an anti-piracy treaty. The United States refused to ratify it. And the U.S. government sent a very learned note saying that under the principles of our Constitution, we don't have a standing army or a large standing army or even a large standing navy, which would be a threat to liberty and to commerce. And therefore, we reserve the right, granted in our Constitution, to issue letters of marque and reprisal to privateers like Jean Lafitte during the War of 1812. Now, we got over that. 10 years after this note was written, we started building up the Navy, having European-style army. But that's this. So I just want to emphasize that what Dr. Deudney is doing is reviving a very old tradition in this country and translating it into terms for the 21st century. This is not, somebody's, not to take away from your originality, but that you're trying to renovate a very ancient philosophical tradition, not simply setting forth your own idiosyncratic theory. Back there.
C.M. Brown, Brandeis University.
Well, you've been writing about global interdependence since I was an undergraduate.
The logic that you're expressing now made more vivid and necessary to think about because of your K-to-K issue. Of course, as you pointed out, was perceived and articulated by people like Morgenthau.
Mm-hmm.
He was pessimistic, not only because of the Cold War, but I think he was pessimistic also because he assumed that in order to make this transition to a kind of a world government that he said was necessary, paradoxically, one would have to engage in a great deal of violence even to establish it. So that's the pessimistic scenario. And you said that you're pessimistic, but I'd like you to articulate, if you would, a little bit, your less pessimistic scenario, your more optimistic scenario. How do we get from here to there? What conditions would have to change? What's the path?
Well, you're absolutely right that one of the reasons why the establishment of world government seemed unappealing to anyone who was a little realist, someone who looked at the world as it actually was with all its plurality, was because of the notion that this state would form like most other states had historically formed through some process of internal war, the disarmament of competing groups. And this is something that is, in one sense, far removed from where we are, but in another sense is still very much with us. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, the Darrell Press and Lieber piece, that the United States, we didn't end the Cold War, the Soviet Union stopped and went away, but we've been continuing to modernize. And we're in some approximation of a first-right position vis-a-vis Russia and China. And there are various factions within the United States military, far better funded than anyone I know, who are pushing for large-scale space weaponization with the scenario of Earth control. And they talk openly. I mean, I sort of partially circulate in these milieus and at these conferences. Andy Marshall stands up and says, we have within reach the possibility of ending it permanently. Ending it being a state system and establishing effective American, world rule. This was James Burnham's plan, and he went on to be head of first editor of the National Review. This is something that's very much still with us. That scenario. Now, on the positive side, one implication of what I'm suggesting is that the images, and I've actually been working on this as a follow-on manuscript, the world government theory in effect, articles and so forth coming out on this, is that we have, because of this domination of our conceptual vocabularies by realism, that it's either anarchy or hierarchy, and you create government by moving from anarchy to hierarchy in some fashion, our image of what a world government would be has traditionally been a world state that would have a monopoly of violence. And as you were suggesting, getting to a monopoly is going to involve coercion. But if we don't have to have a state to interact with other states on a world scale, we doesn't have to have a foreign policy, a world government is novel in the sense that it doesn't have to have the element of hierarchy that all previous political orders had to have. It can be, in my language, purely negarchical, purely republican, purely mutual restraint. So world government seems difficult to get to. The path to it seems violence-strewn, and it seems then potentially a menace because we have this statist image of government that we keep using as the template. If we have a purely Republican image, then we are actually the nuclear arms control regime that we have got in pieces, and the basic image of what we would do, the full image, is actually, we have it in part, and if we were to move towards it fully, the world would not, fundamentally change politically. It would preserve the existing plurality of units. That's to say that I have lowered the image of what it is that what we need to get to, away from this full statist and so forth, lower that. And also I try to raise our sense of how far actually along we are with this. That the arms control regime is the first pieces of it. And also, again, sort of closing the gap by raising our understanding of how far along we actually are, but don't realize we are, is that this process of getting out of anarchy and hierarchy on successively larger scales has been the American project. It's been the single most successful project in the modern state system. The order that we have over the last half centuries that we take for granted with regard to the Western Alliance is an important further step along that path. So it's not like we have to start and doing things that we haven't done. All we have to do is do more of the stuff that we've done so successfully historically on a little bit larger scale.
Ma'am?
First of all, I want to thank you, Michael, Lynn, for bringing us this presentation, and thank you for, it's just absolutely dazzling integration of the whole history of political thought. But it seems to me that carries us up to about the turn of the millennium, where the crucial difference today is where the source of control of weaponry is. Where is that coming from? Coming out of MIT as a political scientist, I'm Jane Pratt. Coming out of MIT as a political scientist, we looked a lot at that idea that if you could contain nuclear proliferation, and in parallel, if you could deal with the causes of conflict, world poverty, deal with economic development, if you could do those things, that you could really have a res publica, you could have that kind of democratic and secure and individual liberty type of world. What we have now is non-state actors in control of weapons of mass destruction.
Potentially so.
Potentially. And different kind of that. We think of mass destruction as nuclear, as biological. Destroying multiple attacks on water sources, multiple attacks on dams, multiple attacks on bridges, destroying the economic infrastructure in an almost totally urbanized nation state is the equivalent of a weapon of mass destruction, and yet the access to and control over those weapons is not any longer in the hands of state actors. So to me that's really, it poses a different kind of problem than controlling nuclear weapons.
Yes. Well, this is obviously far more complicated than what I went into today. I tried to sort of capture the high points. And the contemporary landscape of violence capability with regard to non-state actors has many facets, but I think that we're most concerned about sort of three. First being nuclear. And nuclear stands in a class by itself. Okay, I mean, plutonium contains roughly 1 million times as much releasable energy, pound per pound, as advanced chemical high explosives. Okay, so it's special. It's multiple orders of magnitude different. And we can potentially solve that problem. And we have to a large degree because of this unappreciated totalitarian sector that we have been dealing with it pretty successfully. And it's hypothetical leakages that we're concerned with, not so much in our country, although that's not always possible, but in other countries where state capacity is weaker and so forth. The second type of violence that I'm concerned with here, is biologicals. And I have to tell you that that's where we really get into, you think I'm pessimistic now, you start thinking about biologicals. The contours of this are emerging, but it does seem clear that the capabilities are rapidly improving for the manipulation of the genome and the manipulation of microorganisms. And these capabilities are rapidly diffusing because of biomedical and agricultural and increasingly energy applications. And the capability is not very distinct. There's nothing equivalent to the fissional material. So that poses a regulatory regime issue of very, very difficult dimensions. The third set of violence capability that we're concerned with is what you were pointing to about, well, you see all this in the movies and stuff. People, they fly airplanes into buildings. They can drive trucks with high explosives through tunnels, blah, 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 blah. We have all this scenario of the infrastructure. And it is remarkable how little of that has happened. I mean, given how widespread fertilizer and fuel oil are, after all. And it also points to the fact that you have to look not simply at the supply of the capability, but the demand to use the capability. And we seem to, I don't know exactly, but we don't have a lot of people who want to do that in this country. And the maintenance of that population is a very important part of this. But the truth is that it's going to be like, if it were to get out of hand and we were to start having this kind of thing, that will have profound implications, and you'll basically have a kind of, assuming we can't do this stuff on a global level, even the government of the United States is not going to be able to do it. It's going to become increasingly localistic, kind of neo-feudal, different cities, different regimes, and so forth. And insofar as there's a demand for that kind of destruction, we'll just tolerate it, and we'll harden ourselves in various ways, both psychologically from it occurring and also physically, and we'll get along.
We'll take
60 million people were killed in the Second World War, right? I mean, historically, not that much.
One more question from
Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report. And I'll just preface it by saying many years ago, it actually could be described in decades, I had a high school music class taught by a guy who went on to be a composer of tunes you have heard. And I remember saying to him that many years ago, I don't get Thelonious Monk. I mean, I don't get what he's doing. I don't hear it. And he said, Monk isn't writing for you. He's writing for people like me. I hear what he's doing, and so this fellow Dave Grusin has gone on to write, show tunes and stuff for movies that I do get. The whole time I've been listening to what you're talking about, I agree with Dr. Brett, I presume, about, I understand that it's dazzling, just in the same way that I understand what Einstein was talking about was dazzling, but I don't understand Einstein, and I don't quite get this. And what I'm after is whether you are at a point, or someone is at a point, where this can be put into the kind of language that, for instance, going back to Einstein, when his son asked him, what did you do to become so famous? And he said, he talked about the beetle that's crawling along a curved branch. And he said the beetle, blind beetle crawling along the curved branch, doesn't understand that the branch is curved. I was fortunate enough to see what the beetle couldn't. So I'm interested in whether this is whether this is currently at a point where it could be described in.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, part of what I'm doing today is IR theory and realism and liberalism and so forth, and that clearly wouldn't be part of that narrative that you're pointing to the need for. I have always attempted to build into this key metaphors and kind of images that are easily graspable and have a kind of concreteness to them. The global debris map, for example, I'm very fond of that.
State is devastating.
Against that, and against global village, it's an alternative. And I'm also partially assuming and hoping that the kind of political sensibility that Michael Lynn, for example, manifests of a concern for limited government constitutionalism is not dead in this country. Right? That there is, part of my objective is to connect this globalist institution building agenda, the specifics of which we're all familiar with, as globalists and as American liberal internationalists, but that is alien somehow or disconnected discursively from the American political context. And part of the motivation is, a marketing one. It's like, what's the solution? Well, if you get the first 14 of the Federalist Papers right, it's our tradition is not alien to this project. Our tradition has been doing this project, and it's successful because it's been doing this project, and the liberty that we value depends upon our having done it and doing it again. So I'm very much, I'm not trying to import some European or postmodern or, system theory or kind of thing. I'm saying, no, this is a basic American historical experience and civics. This is the DNA of our political tradition. And I'm hopeful that not only will this help put the globalist agenda to me is like a donut. The middle is missing. The security part of it hasn't been elevated and connected then to the discourse. But also that there are libertarians in this country. How many of them? 15% of people who the Soviet Union was the evil empire. It's gone. So now the evil empire is Washington. Right? And big equals bad. Right? And we want to get rid of big government. And I want, if I'm successful, is to convince people of that mentality that if you want to have limited government, you've got to have properly configured world government of a constitutional, purely mutual restraint nature. Libertarians, people who want political liberty and limited government, should be advocates for a type of strategically focused international institution building.
Well, I promised you a provocative, mind-expanding hour. I think we did it. Thanks again to Deudney.